So to get us going, I would ask David to please take the floor on Gulf states and non-state actors.
طيب السلام عليكم. كنت في الخليج تقريبا 7 سنوات منذ 2005 أولا في الكويت ثم في قطر. في البداية اشتغلت قليلا كنت مدير للمركز البحث الروسي المركز الملكي للدفاع والأمن، ثم كنت بروفيسور يعني للكينغز كوليدج لندن للكلية جوان بن جاسم، لكن رجعت إلى بريطانيا في النهاية في رأس السنة 2014، وذلك هذه هي الأول مرة أن كان عندي الفرصة أن أرجع إلى الخليج، ولذلك شكرا جزيلا دكتور أحمد دكتور ريتشارد ترينز. هذه هي الفرص لهذه المناقشات مهمة جدا بالنسبة لي. شكرا جزيلا. But you'll be relieved to hear that I'll be speaking in English for my presentation. So, I now work back in the UK for King's College London at the UK Defence Academy. And my students have the officers that I teach have a lovely phrase. They often talk about eating sandwiches. So, for example, if there are 2 presentations in an afternoon or in the same day, and if in the first presentation some of the ideas are taken from the second presentation, the person in the second presentation will say, they have eaten my sandwiches. They have said some of the things that I was going to say. And so, some of my sandwiches today have been eaten. But they have been eaten, I think, in a very good way, to be honest, because we have had a lovely setup for me. So I don't have to go through more of the concepts and the ideas about the evolution of non-state actors. I'll just go straight in and talk about some examples from the Gulf of using almost as the word non-state actors. So this is what I'm looking at. It's the basic question of why. Why have the Gulf states engaged with non-state actors? What are the rationales? What are the consequences of this? And some of the so whats, a few concluding thoughts. But I'm an academic, so I feel the need for a methodological note and a quick caveat or two. All states engage with non-state actors, of course, but I'm just talking about the Gulf here, basic kind of a point. My title talks about Gulf states and their usage of non-state actors, and the Gulf states are quite different, as you all know as well as I do. So it's something to think about. Can we reasonably talk about Gulf states, or do we need to be very specific and individualize? This is something that we can sort of think about. This is the beginning of a longer research project, and this will be something in my mind as we continue. I'm going to use the example of Qatar quite a lot. This is not necessarily because Qatar use non-state actors more than any other state, but as I said, I've lived in Qatar for quite a long time. I wrote my PhD on it. That's where I was the director of a think tank, and my book's on Qatar. So it's very easy for me. I know the foreign policy of Qatar. I feel I know the foreign policy of Qatar better, so it's easier for me to use those examples. So keep that in mind. And we've got this definitional issue, which was very nicely raised at the very end. Another one of the sandwiches that has been eaten that I don't need to worry so much about, I think. My point is, this is an introductory sort of a talk to a wide-ranging issue. So I'm not going to get bogged down in the definitions of these things. We can have a disagreement and a chat at the end about, because it depends on time, of course. A non-state actor in 1 month or 1 year is a part of the political process later on. So maybe they're not a non-state actor. It's difficult to say. But I'm going to broadly ignore those issues if you'll forgive me for the moment. So why do the Gulf states engage with non-state actors? A variety of reasons. Some of them are fairly straightforward and obvious. Some of them, I think, are a bit more complex. So the Gulf states are relatively young as independent entities. I think, on occasion, we can look at foreign policy being used as part of the nation-building project, as part of attempts to develop an international or regional reputation, build influence, differentiate the states. The reason I mentioned the invention of tradition here, This is it's a super book by a left-wing British historian, Eric Hobsbawm, and it focuses on the British Isles. There's a chapter on Scotland, for example, and he talks about the invention of the kilt, if you see what I mean, and all the accoutrements and the associations of dances and all these sorts of ideas. The point being that, you know, tradition and states, they are manufactured. I don't mean that in a negative way, if you see what I mean, but they are constructed, they are built. And maybe we can see examples of Gulf states engaging with non-state actors as part of this wider repertoire, almost, of state building. Maybe we can look to Kuwait before 1990. A lot of relations with, for example, the PLO, lots of different actors. Maybe this was part of Kuwait's desire to forge an international reputation for itself, to build its importance regionally and internationally. Certainly in the Qatari case from the late 1980s, I talk about, in the late 1980s, we have the emergence of Hamad bin Khalifa, of course, who is the crown prince then, of course, but in reality, he's basically running the Qatari state from the late 1980s onwards. And not coincidentally, at the same time that Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani emerges, Qatar as an international state bursts on the international scene. And this continues throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Mostly, I think we associate this with unusual relations with Iran or with Israel, for example, but also with non-state actors. Offices for the PLO, support for Hamas, sort of political support for Hezbollah over the years, these sorts of things. So maybe this is one of the rationales we can look at. Maybe it's about, as I sort of say in a different context, building legitimacy and building influence. The ultimate question of why has Qatar been supporting broadly the Ikhwan in recent years? It's not because Qataris are brothers. They are not of the Ikhwan. Of course they're not. But I think they made a calculation, or some people in the elite made a calculation early on that the Brotherhood were a coming force in Arab politics. And so one of their calculations was, well, if they're going to be there, maybe we should attempt to build our relationships with them early on so we can be primus inter pares. We can be particularly important. We have ideological and political alignment. You know, basically what I'm saying here, it's not controversial, it's fairly straightforward, that states support people that they agree with. Statement of the obvious to a degree. States support like-minded allies for whatever reason, because of a religious conviction, a political conviction, or an ideological preference. Maybe this is one of the examples we can use is Saudi Arabia and the Mujahideen, of course, in the 80s in Afghanistan. In terms of the UAE, there is an absolute consistency to Emirati foreign policy in many ways. The way that the state pursues its foreign policy, either with non-state actors or just pursues its policy more generally, is by supporting groups and people that it agrees with. And speaking to Dr. Jamal Al-Suwaidi a couple of weeks ago, launching his book, and some interesting discussions last night as well, about the Emirati sort of philosophy. It's to do with the importance, you all know better than me, I suspect, of, in English we would talk about the separation of church and state. I don't think that translates particularly well into Arabic, but it's something to do with trying to remove political Islam as a ruling factor, something like this. So the Emirates supports broadly. So I think the Emirates supports those sorts of groups in Libya and indeed elsewhere. We have simple pragmatism. Why does Qatar have some curious relationship with the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra, with the likes of Ahrar al-Sham? Jabhat al-Nusra is an Al-Qaeda associated group. That's what they say. They are. It's fairly straightforward. And the Qatari state has had the leader, al-Jilani of Jabhat al-Nusra, on Al Jazeera several times, as you know, in recent months and years, to try to bring the group into the wider fold, if you see what I mean. Why is this? Why The specific nature of the relationship is difficult to pin down, but there is something there, definitely. And why is this? It is not, of course, I think it's quite obvious that it is not because Qatar supports the worldview of the likes of Jabhat al-Nusra. Nothing really, to my mind, about the Qatari state reflects those ideologies, nothing at all. But Qatar, in this case, I think we could say, is being very pragmatic. I think the Qatari logic runs that, well, Syria, we have a problem. The main problem is Bashar al-Assad. Jabhat al-Nusra, whether we like them or we don't like them, they are a fact on the ground. They are, like them or dislike them, they are a significant force. They have potentially quite a lot of power. And if we want to get rid of the number one problem in Syria, which from the Qatari perspective is Bashar al-Assad, his regime, then we need to use them. We need to align with them to some indefinable degree. I think that's the realpolitik, the pragmatism that we see there. Foreign actors, states, often have some sort of legitimacy deficit. All I mean by that is that it can be fairly difficult for other states to involve themselves in politics around the region. It's difficult to do for the obvious kinds of reasons. So we have these non-state actors sometimes, or these proxies that states support. In the Qatari example again, if you forgive me using another Qatari example, the likes of Abdul Karim Belhaj, his Al-Watan party, it used the Qatari colours on some of the literature, on some of the cars and things. The link with Qatar is absolutely crystal clear. And this is, presumably, this is about Qatar attempting to support, obviously enough, a like-minded kind of an ally. There is the idea of expediency, almost risk transfer, if you will. So states have a desire to act, they want to act, but it can be difficult. Unsurprisingly, domestic considerations, whether this is there's a low tolerance for casualties, whether this is minimizing, it's just politically too difficult to do it, to act, then maybe we could use, a state might use a non-state actor as a more deniable, an easier way to act. I think this kind of rationale is probably sprinkled along a lot of these examples that I'm talking about. We have necessity, a simple rationale. States can only do what they can do. States use the resources that they have. So if we are talking about Kuwait in the 70s, say, when their foreign policy was very active, what resources did the Kuwaiti state have? It didn't necessarily have a very well-developed foreign ministry with lots of diplomats that were going out and learning the situation and creating alliances. Didn't necessarily have, a cultural power stemming from the film industry or whatever it may be. It didn't have a proverbial Al Jazeera. But what it did have was a certain amount of money. So you use the resources that you have. And if you can use these resources with a non-state actor, then all the better. It's also about exactly the same sort of logic for Qatar, again, with Libya. It's about a lack of resources. Just flipping this Kuwait example around. Qatar is a state of 270, 280,000 people. It just cannot act. Its foreign ministry is too small, it's too young to develop all of these kinds of contacts. It's kind of an empirical impossibility, I think, if you see what I mean. So that's slightly problematic. Okay, so for Kuwait, in that Qatari example, that's what they've got to do. They need to leverage the abilities, almost, of these non-state actors. I use PowerPoint presentations because they keep me nice and ordered and keep me going through, so I don't commit them to memory. I can waffle about them quite well, I think, at times, but I need them as a structure. If I can move on to a couple of...
5 minutes, so go to your key points.
I'll go to a couple of conclusions then. One of the conclusions is that, to do with the usage of non-state actors, one of the things that need to be careful of is that, empirically, if we look at civil wars, for example, the empirical research tells us that civil wars will be longer and bloodier if the opposition is fragmented. It makes sense, of course. If there are lots of different opposition groups, it is more and more difficult for them to come together to create a cohesive mass in order to pressure the government forces, either into negotiation or militarily. So one of the worries that we have that is obviously perfectly encapsulated in Syria is that we have different actors around the region, I suppose, engaging with these different groups, and as we've seen, to everyone's cost, it fragments the opposition and it elongates the war. This is something that we need to sort of keep in mind. I had a second wonderful conclusion as well that was really, really insightful, but I can't quite remember it right now. As soon as I sit down, I'll remember what it is, but I'll have to leave it there. Please ask me some questions and hopefully we can have a chat about this later on. Thank you very much.